The history of Great Britain. This is Buckingham Palace. The official residence of Elizabeth II, the reigning Queen of the United Kingdom. It is situated in the heart of England's capital city, London. It attracts millions of tourists each year to see with their own eyes the buildings and monuments that embody the identity of a nation and its heritage. Nearby, the most important royal church, Westminster Abbey. It witnessed the crowning of 38 kings and queens. The first was Elizabeth's distant ancestor, William the Conqueror, who reigned almost 1,000 years ago. We can divide the history of Great Britain into periods. And take a closer look at each of them. So let's start from the beginning. First comes a prehistoric Britain, which includes Neolithic and Bronze Ages, and also the Iron Age. Then comes Roman Britain, with coming of Romans on a British shore. Then Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic tribes took control over the land. After that, the menacing tribes of Vikings invaded the British Isles. Then Middle Ages. Meanwhile, the Normans invaded, then Tudor dynasty, and then the period of civil war and revolution, the rule of Stuart dynasty, the time when Britain was an empire and a sea power. Then comes the Victorian Britain and modern Britain up to nowadays. So, lying off the northwest coast of Europe, there are two large islands and several much smaller ones. The largest island is called Great Britain. The other large one is called Ireland. Geographically speaking, they are all called the British Isles. And there are two states in the British Isles, the UK and the Republic of Ireland. The United Kingdom is made up of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. By the way, the earliest known name for Great Britain is Albion. Albion is the original Roman name for Britain. It may come from the Latin word albus, meaning white, from the white chalk cliffs around Dover, the first part of England to be seen when crossing the sea from the European mainland. In the course of the first millennium BC, and possibly earlier, the great transcultural immigration from continental Europe caused the establishment of Celtic languages in the island, eventually giving the rise to the Celtic group. What languages were spoken in that islands before is unknown. These people built places like Stonehenge, which is the most famous one, although across country there are hundreds of them. They are arranged to form some kind of calendar which shows the summer and winter solstice. The people were pagans. The high priest druids were not just priests but also judges, politicians, doctors or advisors. Over time, waves of Celtic-speaking people arrived from European continent who soon came to form the Brittonic, Gaelic and Pictish people. Pict, from Latin, the word pictus means colored. These people were not a unified people, but were rather many tribes who shared a similar pagan religion, language, and culture. In 43 AD, a great Roman army of Julius Caesar descended upon the shores of Britain. The strongest ever in this part of the globe, tens of thousands of highly organized fighting men from all corners of the Roman world. So they came to put an end to the independence of this obscure, unknown island once and for all. The Romans, with their Emperor Claudius, invaded, conquering what is now called England and Wales, but they failed to conquer the Pictish tribes who lived on what's now Scotland. Scotland was called before also Caledonia. Okay, they couldn't conquer the north, so they retreated to the fortification, Hadrian's Wall. The Rome lived by expanding its land wherever possible, wherever they were allowed to. So the Emperor Claudius successfully led the invasion, and they ruled England as a colony for the next 600 years. The Romans brought with them elements of their own civilization. They constructed roads and cities with baths, aqueducts, the theaters, brought traders and craftsmen. The Romans built the Hadrian Wall. Their conquered lands became part of the Roman Empire, becoming the province of Britannia. They brought Roman customs and laws, improved infrastructure, and connected many towns and cities with Roman roads. Some cities were initially military camps. So the word military camp in Latin is castra. So derivatives of this word can be found in city names such as Lancaster, Winchester, Leicester, and Gloucester. Needless to say, there are lots of vocabulary remained of the Latin origin. Latin was the language of elites and English for plebeians. The Anglo-Roman population grew a lot with time. The Emperor Hadrian ordered to build a massive wall between England and Scotland to prevent attacks from the Picts and Scots. Known as Hadrian's Wall, it marked the northern border of the Roman Empire. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site of the baths may have been a center of worship. So all these baths were used by Celts. The springs of water were dedicated to the goddess Sulis, whom the Romans identified with Minerva. Then, one day, the Romans needed power to fight on the continent. They withdrew their men from Britain. Some of them moved to France. That's why part of the France is called Britannia. It was quite a mass migration. Rediscovered from the 18th century, the city's Roman remains have become one of the city's main attractions. They may be viewed almost exclusively at the Roman Baths Museum. The Roman Baths are a well-preserved firma in the city of Bath in England. This temple was constructed at the beginning of Roman time in Britain. Its presence led to the development of the small Roman urban settlement known as Aqua Sulis. The Roman baths, designed for public bathing, were used until the end of Roman rule in Britain, and as we know, they ruled in the 5th century. Some stories we may become aware are from the movies. King Edward marched north and defeated a Scottish knight, William Wallace, in a battle, but Wallace managed to escape. He was later captured and executed, but his efforts allowed another Scottish hero, Robert the Bruce, to rise up and defeat the English. So Scotland became independent. So William Wallace was a late 13th century Scottish knight who became one of the main leaders during the First War of Scottish Independence against the King Edward I of England. So we know the Braveheart. It's an American epic historical fiction war film directed and co-produced by Mel Gibson. When the Romans left, there was a great migration of Germanic tribes. There were the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons with their language, Old English. With time, for unknown reasons, the Jutes disappeared from history, but the Angles and Saxons eventually formed heptarchy. Heptarchy, okay? The means 7 kingdoms: Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. These tribes came from northern Germany. They brought the tradition. One of the reasons why all these tribes came might be the climate change or political turmoil, the Huns, the King Attila. So they brought some of their traditions, like one of them is to bury family members in a yard behind the house. Also, they started drinking. They brought the tradition of drinking ale in an early age because of hygiene. So wells, where they took the water, the wells were something magic at that time because of their water quality. Also, the tradition of a feast came, okay, celebrations. The slow Christianization of Britain began, although the quality of Christianity is a big question because of the lack of ability to read. We know the story of St. Patrick, who is famous for bringing Christianity to the Irish. So what else we can say? At that time, the Norman and Vikings raids on the British Isles began. The British Isles soon saw numerous Norse raiders from Scandinavia. These were the Vikings, and they began settlements on many of the Scottish Isles, the Isle of Man, and they even founded the city of Dublin in Ireland. The Scots and the Picts then decided to unite. The Norsemen had a dramatic impact on the Isles, so it's no wonder some of the words in the English language have Norse origin. Viking means to raid, the fight for the right to plunder, and the British lands were better for food, they were more fertile. The words knife, shirt, window, dirt, anger, so these words came from the Norse languages, and from the Danish language came the sound the, okay? In words like this, them, those. Okay. At the end of the 8th century, the Normans began to invade and conquer England. In the second half of the 9th century, only Alfred the Great, the ruler of the Kingdom of Wessex, could resist them. He united the Anglo-Saxons, and so the country could effectively resist the Normans. But he had to hand over the northern part of the country. With time, the Normans assimilated with the local population. Alfred the Great, who could hardly speak English, he spoke only Latin, was the first king to be called the King of England. So we can say he created England. In the picture, Alfred depicted in a stained glass window in Bristol Cathedral. To sum up, the Norman conquest brought to England the feudal system. Okay, the feudal system is the system with classes. The first comes the king, the noblemen, lords, barons, earls, also bishops and abbots in church. Then come the knights. Then finally peasants. Normans also brought new impressive stone castles, bigger and more impressive churches. The Domesday Book was created. In about 1085, William the Conqueror, he was also French-speaking, ordered a book that would contain information on who owned what, how much tax they should pay, and they did it throughout the whole country. However, peasant life was not all hardship. The importance of religion in society meant that there were some holidays, there were some days off. There were shows of strength such as wrestling and fighting. Peasants also drank a form of weak homemade beer. There were also traveling musicians who would sometimes pass through the villages, sing and play instruments such as lutes, pipes, drums. Okay, due to these agreements, King Edward returned to his plan to claim to the throne and invaded France, beginning the Hundred Years' War. The English achieved victories thanks to the technical superiority of the longbow. Okay, they had lots of victories at they won the Battle of Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, but they were unable to conquer the French with the appearance of Joan of Arc, who lifted the French spirit. Then eventually caused a bitter rivalry that eventually caused a bitter rivalry between several parts who claimed the throne, the houses of York and Lancaster. Tensions were high until a bloody age of war started between these two royal families. And there's a beginning of Wars of the Roses. Meanwhile, the Black Death was a bubonic plague. It was a pandemic that broke out in Afro-Eurasia. It is the most fatal pandemic recorded in human history. The bubonic plague caused the death of about 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa. One very important document at that time was Magna Carta, was issued in 1215 by King John of England, and it was the first document to put into writing the principles that the king and his government was not above the law. It sought to prevent the king from exploiting his power and place limits of royal authority. It was necessary to make peace between the unpopular king and a group of rebellious barons. It promised the protection of church rights, protection for the barons from illegal imprisonment, access to justice, and limitations on feudal payments to the crown. Okay, so the Yorks and Lancasters were descended from the same family. The houses of York and Lancaster both traced their lineage to the sons of Edward III of the House of Plantagenet, who ruled as England's king from 1327 until 1377. So what were the result of this war? The end of the House of Lancaster. Then the House of Tudor inherits the Lancastrian claim. Then there was a final Yorkist defeat. End of the Plantagenet dynasty, establishment of the Tudor dynasty, end of the Middle Ages in England, strengthening of the English monarchy under the Tudors, and the dawn of the English Renaissance. In 1534, Henry VIII divorce, split with the church, creating his own Church of England. This ultimately led to a series of religious differences between future English monarchs in between his 6 wives. He had a paranoia and suspicion that caused tens of thousands of executions, including his friends and wives. During his 38-year reign, Henry married 6 wives, executed thousands for treason, and radically changed English religion. He also changed parliamentary powers and the Royal Navy. He even transformed the postal service. In 1527, Henry tried to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne Boleyn. Catherine had borne him a daughter, but importantly for Henry, had not produced a son and heir. When the Pope refused to grant him an annulment, Henry announced England's separation from the Roman Catholic Church. So, an infamous device to remember of King Henry VIII's wives goes as follows. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Okay? So needless to say, we all think of him as that overweight tyrant. But when he was young, he was well-liked, good-looking, athletic, charismatic. So what are the names of his wives? Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Okay, so during this time also William Shakespeare was born. So what about William Shakespeare's interesting facts? Shakespeare was born in Stratford. Only later that city changed the name into Stratford-upon-Avon. Also, Shakespeare is widely considered the world's greatest dramatist. He wrote 38 plays and 154 sonnets. Shakespeare is most likely to have received a classical Latin education at King's New School in Stratford. He married Anne Hathaway when he was only 18. Anne was 26 and she was 3 months pregnant when they married. Their first child, Susanna, was born 6 months after their marriage. They later had 2 twins, Hamnet and Judith. Shakespeare had 7 brothers and sisters. What else? Shakespeare worked as an actor, writer, and co-owner of a drama company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later known as the King's Men. So what about his own invented phrases? Some of them are, "We have seen better days," means we are in poor condition. "Neither rhyme nor reason," if someone says without common sense or logic. "I haven't slept one wink," I didn't sleep at all. "The clothes make the man," means people are judged by the way they dress. "My own flesh and blood." It's all Greek to me, we say when something is completely, we don't understand. What's done is done. All that glitters isn't gold, means things are not as good as they appear to be. The world is my oyster. I can achieve whatever I want to in life. Wild goose chase, a hopeless search for something unattainable. Break the ice, my favorite. Brave New World, used ironically to refer to a new hopeful period. Also, some of the writers took it as a title for his book. Melted into thin air. Okay, and many others. Okay, what about the Game of Thrones? In the Game of Thrones characters have close connections with not one but many historical figures. I'll give you some clues for the historical figure and see if you can guess which counterpart character they are in the Game of Thrones. Good luck. Charles VI of France was born to the House of Valois during the bloodiest time of the 100 Years' War. It was also 20 years after the plague arrived on France's shores. So this made a terrible time. In his 20s, he randomly killed 4 of his knights during the hunting trip. Then he forgot his name, refused to bathe for a year, and didn't let anyone touch him because he said he was made of glass. So we see how they're similar, the Mad King and Charles VI. Margaret of Anjou became Queen of England by the time she was 15 years old, when she married Henry VI. She was very strong, powerful woman. Margaret of Anjou was confronted by a very troubling time, and just like Cersei, she was extremely unpopular. Margaret effectively played the role of kingmaker as the head of the House of Lancaster. She was later imprisoned in the Tower of London, which is strikingly similar to when Cersei was a prisoner in her own kingdom. In case you didn't know, George Martin based the Ironborn after the Vikings, the Dothraki after the Mongols, where Drogo was Genghis Khan, and the Night Watch as a Knight Templar. At first glance, it's fairly easy to draw comparisons between Joan of Arc and Brienne of Tarth. Physically, the only thing strikingly different was between them is the size. Okay, although Brienne stands quite tall and Joan of Arc was estimated to be only 157 centimeters, they have similar attire. Joan of Arc was known to wear men's clothing and armor, either by choice or circumstance. Both women are also virgins, which earned both the nickname of the Maid. King Henry VI was a weak ruler and lost much of the land gained by the previous rulers. Richard of York came to help and became Lord Protector of England. His mission is to save the crown, which is very similar to Ned Stark's action in season 1. Cecily of York was the wife of Richard of York. She was known as a proud cis for her temper and virtue. She was also the mother of 12 children, including 2 that became kings. No one, with the possible exception of Cersei, fought for their children harder than Catelyn Stark. She also fought right alongside her son Robb, supporting him just like Cecily Neville did to get Edward the throne of England. In this sense, we can see that Margaret Anjou, who is Cersei, and Cecily Neville, who is Catelyn, played the role of kingmakers. Each was deeply involved in the War of Roses. Cecily outlived 10 of her children, but just like in Game of Thrones, only 2 of her daughters survived. Her House of York, the White Rose as their symbol, they had a white rose as their symbol, and Margaret of Anjou, the House of Lancaster, used the red rose. Okay, next. Edward of Winchester was the son of Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI. From the very beginning, he led a troubled life because he was an only child, born 8 years after they married, and Henry may have been out of town when Edward was conceived. Nasty rumors spread that Margaret slept around to get pregnant. We're looking at you, Cersei. It was said of Edward, this boy, though only 13, already talks of nothing but cutting off heads or making war, as if he had everything in his hands or was the god of battle. Another similarity is him with Caligula. Okay, he's probably the most hated villain of all time, and with good reason. He's an annoying brat like Joffrey. Caligula, by the way, rose to a power at a very young age, so his idea of power was extremely distorted. Okay, Elizabeth of York was making Cecily of Neville her grandmother. She had an important role to play in the War of Roses, and in a lot of ways her story directly ties into the narrative created by George Martin. Anne Boleyn and her husband Henry VIII got along famously until their first child, Elizabeth, was born. Several miscarriages unfortunately followed, and due to Anne's inability to produce a male heir, their relationship was severely strained. Henry then found an affection for Jane Seymour, which obviously made Anne extraordinarily jealous. Things went from bad to worse as false charges were brought against her following with her beheading shortly thereafter. The reign of Elizabeth I was a highly fruitful period for England. The Spanish decided to settle a score with England once and for all and sent an armada to take control of the island. Elizabeth defeated the Spanish invaders. It was a renaissance of art and culture, including the rise of William Shakespeare. She never took a husband, believing they would rival each other, giving her the nickname Virgin Queen. Daenerys Targaryen is definitely not a virgin, but after the death of her husband, Khal Drogo, she never took another husband. But, honestly, what are cooler than dragons? We are beyond the War of the Roses by George Martin certainly borrowed characters from other historical figures. Claudius was installed as the emperor of Rome after Caligula was killed. The Praetorians believed Claudius to be dim-witted and easily manipulated, but they were quickly proved wrong. Some historians say that Claudius acted unintelligent in order to protect himself, and that might be true. The second he became an emperor, he suddenly had a brain. Also, despite physical abnormalities at a young age, he overcame his handicap and vastly expanded the Roman Empire. By the way, Tyrion Lannister has the healthiest dose of wit too. He loved wine. "I drink and I know things. That's what I do," said Tyrion, giving the most precise description of himself. With the history in mind, it would be criminal to leave out Roman emperor and military genius Julius Caesar. He used to say, "Veni, vidi, vici," or "I came, I saw, I conquered." Perhaps more well known than Julius Caesar's life is his death. On the Ides of March the 15th, on Roman calendar, he was betrayed by his friends and compatriots, brutally stabbed to death on the floor of the Roman Senate. Not longer after, Jon Snow became Lord Commander of the King's Watch, and his own men did much the same thing. Just to let you know, fortunately, Jon Snow had the magic of Melisandre, who brought him back to life. Jon Snow, like Julius Caesar, successfully unified the kingdoms of Westeros to fight together, much like Julius Caesar conquered Europe. So who was Melisandre? In 1903, a holy man named Rasputin came to St. Petersburg, Russia. We know a lot about Rasputin's immorality. With a reputation for healing powers and known as a person who can see future, he made impression on residents, even on the member of ruling Romanov family. Prince Alexei was a hemophiliac from birth, and the Romanovs were desperate for help. Rasputin used his divine powers and healed the boy. After that, he gained the trust of the Tsar and Tsarina, becoming the Romanovs' most trusted advisor. Once upon a time, in Italy, there was a man named Niccolo Machiavelli, and he wrote a book for his prince, Lorenzo de' Medici of Florence. The book The Prince contained a series of lessons that are still relevant to this day, none of which are more famous than "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." Machiavelli found his inspiration from The Prince directly from the exploits of Cesare Borgia. Borgia was a skilled soldier and even better general. He was known for his ruthless tactics too. During a revolt by his own people, he called for a truce, then promptly killed all of his enemies. The Borgia family has been linked to the Lannisters, as Cesare has a powerful father like Jaime had. King Tywin. Also, both Cesare and Jaime became major generals during their respective lifetimes. The similarity is Cesare is rumored to have had a love affair with his own sister, just like Jaime did. Now we arrive at Henry VIII, and through him you can see how the lineage of the English crown influenced the story of Game of Thrones. Henry VIII wasn't necessarily a bad king as far as England's governance is concerned, but he did stir up chaos and controversy over the handling of his 6 wives. Ever heard ever heard of the Protestant Revolution? Well, in short, it was caused by Henry VIII's desire to divorce his wife and the Pope's unwillingness to grant it. The physical resemblance between the two kings is obvious. Another similarity between the two men is that they had wives that were either accused or actually did engage in incest. Whereas Henry VIII made it up to get rid of his wife Anne Boleyn, Robert Baratheon's wife no doubt did engage in it, bearing 3 children from her brother Jaime. When Queen Elizabeth of England died without the heir, her closest male relative was James VI of Scotland. James was elected as King of England and Scotland, but several assassination attempts were made by Catholic conspirators. One such assassination attempt was the Gunpowder Plot by Guy Fawkes, who tried to blow the Parliament. So since then, November the 5th is known as Guy Fawkes Night in London and all across the United Kingdom. It is an annual British fireworks shows commemorating the failure of the gunpowder plot in 1605. Okay, another topic, the slavery in the British Empire. The transport of enslaved people to the American colonies accelerated in the second half of the 17th century. In 1660, the English monarch Charles II created the Royal African Company to trade enslaved people and African goods. The Royal African Company enjoyed a monopoly to transport enslaved people to the English colonies. In about just 30 years, the company bought 125,000 captives on the African coast, losing 20% of them to death on the journey from the African coast to the Americas. Slavery formed a cornerstone of the British Empire in the 18th century. Every colony had enslaved people. Slavery was more than a labor system. It also influenced every aspect of colonial life and culture. A famous tradition, English tea or cream tea. A cream tea, also known as a Devon cream tea, Devonshire tea, or Cornish cream tea, is a form of afternoon tea light meal consisting of tea with scones, whipped cream, and jam. Traditionally a specialty of Devon and Cornwall, cream teas are often in those 2 countries as well as in other parts of England and everywhere in the Commonwealth. In Ireland, the Great Famine struck. We remember that Henry VIII created the Kingdom of Ireland. The disease was killing potato plants. Ireland, which had merged with Britain, relied heavily on this crop for food. But the British government forced Ireland to export what little food they had to other areas without any help. Ireland's population plummeted by half due to starvation and emigration to countries like the United States. So it was an extremely difficult time for the Republic of Ireland. Okay. So, Victoria. So there's a start of Victorian period. It was the period of industrial, political, scientific, and military changes. By the way, Queen Victoria's white wedding dress launched a trend that endures to this day. The wedding took place on the February the 10th, 1840 in London, marriage of Queen Victoria to her cousin Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. So there are some fascinating facts about Queen Victoria. Her first name wasn't Victoria. Queen Victoria was originally named Alexandrina Victoria after her godfather, Tsar Alexander I. She was the first member of the royal family to live at Buckingham Palace. She was barely 5 feet tall, about 152 centimeters. She became queen when she was 18. Growing up, she was under constant supervision. She was multilingual. She spoke English, German, also studied French, Italian, and Latin. She survived a multitude assassination attempts. She proposed to her husband, not he. She popularized Christmas tree. She and her husband had 9 children. She became the first known carrier of hemophilia, known as the royal disease. She was the first monarch to ride a train. She is the second longest reigning British monarch after Elizabeth II. Okay, we know from 2015, the longest reign belongs to the Elizabeth II now, but the second one comes Queen Victoria. Well, what else we can say? Her name lives on all over the world. Buildings, parks, roads, theaters are called after her name. All this we can see in India and New Zealand. Her name lives on all over the world. Queen Victoria was declared as an Empress of India. During the 19th century, the world was forever changed by the Industrial Revolution. The society was transformed by technological advances and increasing mechanization, and would launch Britain to global dominance. The establishment of railways and trains also transformed transport forever instead of traveling days by horse or carriage. Some of the greatest innovations and inventions were the sewing machine, the fire extinguisher, steam-powered engines, turbines, the electric motor, and photography. The telegraph was also a major invention, as a message could now be sent from Britain to India in a matter of hours. Even the speed limit ticket was invented in England. It was invented in 1896. The first ever speeding ticket was issued and given to a driver named Walter Arnold in Kent for going 4 times the speed limit, 13 kilometers per hour. You are young and healthy, with no commitments. The world is your oyster. Using the context of the example above, the phrase "the world is your oyster" means that you can achieve anything you wish in life and go anywhere because you have the opportunity or ability to do so.